Earlier that day I watched as a small transparent creature was carried up onto the shore by the waters of the Atlantic. Never before in real life had I seen anything like this strange mushroom-shaped animal, and I wondered how it had drifted so far from the depths of the sea. At first I thought that the substance of the creature was entirely clear, but upon further inspection I realized that it was a sort of off-pink like the color of a carnation. I assumed that these pinkish innards were the animal's brain. I did not know at the time that jellyfish lacked bones, a brain, and a heart. I also didn't know that the stinging cells in jellyfish tentacles remain active until the body of the creature decomposes. Foolishly, I attempted to pick it up off the beach, only to feel an immediate burning sensation in my fingers. Not until that moment in my life did I realize deceased things could have such a powerful effect on the living. As I felt tears flood my eyes, I began running back to the beach house to grab the bottle of aloe vera gel from the medicine cabinet. My father was waiting by the door. The look in his eyes hinted at an awareness of the pain I was experiencing, and he consoled me. He told me that the discomfort would escape me in time, that suffering always fades. I believed him. That evening, following a late lunch of leftover ham on rye, we decided to go back to the beach and toss the ball around. We made our way down to the storage room beneath the house, and I watched my father disappear for a few moments before emerging with a pair of worn mitts. One was your classic Rawlings, but the logo on the other was too faded to be recognized. I snatched up the Rawlings and took off in the direction of the ocean. At my feet, it had just gotten late enough for the hermit crabs to arise from areas unseen and begin to drag their shells across billions and billions of mineral particles. Suddenly I heard my father yelling from 20 or 30 yards down the sandy expanse and squinted my eyes to prepare for the sight of a ball soaring through the black air. Toss, squint, catch. Toss, squint, catch. It went on like that for several minutes before we gradually and carelessly transitioned into throwing each other pop flies, pushing each other further and further back across the expanse with every throw. The sun was nearly lost below the horizon line when I launched the ball toward the constellations one last time and observed its two seams disappear in the distance. The familiar pop of cork-covered yarn landing comfortably in his mitt never came. Instead, I heard the shuffling of feet followed by a cry of pain, but I had already known it had already come running. I found my father sprawled across a shallow dune of sand, clutching his bloodied foot, and immediately started to scream in the direction of the house for my mother to call an ambulance. "Are you okay?" I remember asking him repeatedly, though I could see how torn up the skin of his big toe was. And his answers were indirect. "Come sit beside me," was all he would say, so I did. I waited with my father on that shallow dune of sand for the red lights to arrive. When they finally did, the tide had almost risen to where we were seated, but that night it didn't have the height to submerge even the shallowest of dunes. After he had been taken away, I began to recollect the horrible image of blood seeping from his lesion. It was the first and last time that I would vividly remember my father bleeding. It was also one of the first, but certainly not one of the last times that I would contemplate his unmistakable mortality. Before I returned to the beach house with my mother and the rest of the family, a shape in my lower peripheral vision caught my eye. I reached down and plucked it out of the sand. It was an enormous, jagged, blood-covered seashell, freshly stained, the type of shell that you press against your ear to hear the ocean within it. But when I brought it to my own, I heard nothing but the sound of silence. It has been said that the moment before the human soul transcends its physical form, the brain attached to the soul replays a lifetime of split-second memories for the individual to re-experience, tiny tastes of moments which they will never taste again, a fleeting recollection of existence, raindrops in a storm of nostalgia. I cannot validate this claim because I am still breathing, my heart is still pumping, my blood is still flowing, but I can tell you that I experienced something reminiscent of this phenomenon alongside my father's deathbed. His skin looked cold, his face was extraordinarily pale. He looked just like a dying person was supposed to look, trapped on the side of something that they no longer could call home. But I wasn't ready for him to go just yet. I needed something more to hold on to than this horrible image of a colorless man, his limp fingers, shaved head, and expressionless face. I needed anything more. So as I observed him exhaling the last traces of his life into the air of the hospital, I urged these traces to take the form of something tangible, something that could be entered, and they did. They took the form of early morning mist. Before my father's mist disintegrated into nothingness, before it became too thin a thing for the human eye to know, I leapt into the air and flattened myself out for absorption. I was not provided with transient moments or fragments of memories, but whole, richly detailed first-person experiences, and the first memory that I was permitted to relive took place during the 5th year of my life. My physical form was that of a 5-year-old, but my mind remained the same. I thought and felt like the man that I would be in a short decade and a half, but I could not verbalize my thoughts and I could not move my arms or legs. It was as if the past had control over my body, but the present commanded my mind. I sat on the edge of my bed with my feet dangling just above the floor. Although my air conditioner was on full blast and my bedroom door was closed to trap the cold air, the first thing that I noticed was the music coming from somewhere downstairs, probably the kitchen. My father loved to play music in the kitchen while he made pancakes or waffles for us most Sunday mornings. The second thing that I noticed was the familiar rising smell of cooked batter, my favorite scent. I hopped off the bed, grabbed my socks from the chair beside my desk, and slipped them on. It was such a beautiful day, one that I assumed we would take advantage of later that afternoon by playing catch in the boulevard, but it all depended upon his mood. I stopped at the window on my way to the kitchen table and gazed out at our front yard, studying the birch trees. As the Grateful Dead's ripple faded into the wonderfully solemn broke-down palace, I took my seat and waited patiently to be served. I was excited. In reality, I hadn't tasted my father's homemade pancakes in almost 5 years, so as he turned to offer them to me, I couldn't help but smile. I glanced down at the golden cakes and grabbed my fork, but before delving into them, I closed my eyes and listened closely to the lyrics which surrounded me. Fare you well, fare you well. I love you more than words can tell. Listen to the river sing sweet songs to rock my soul. A moment later, I was raised up on some sort of rounded mass. It took a few moments to register that I was on a pitcher's mound, that I was in uniform surrounded by a crowd of spectators. I attempted to get into the mindset of pitching as quickly as possible because I wanted to cherish every second of such a miraculous opportunity, but at first all I could think about was how desperately I was still craving pancakes. I was able to see with what I would describe as a kind of internal vision. My body could physically relive the experience in the same manner that I had originally lived it. I suppose that in truth I wasn't so much reliving the experience as I was traveling back in time to the initial occurrence, but I could be focusing on and thinking about the other aspects of my surroundings during the process. I didn't have to stare into the mitt of the catcher to pitch the ball. It happened automatically, and I realized this almost immediately when my actions began to effortlessly play out before me. You can imagine that I spent the rest of the inning observing my father. Every action, every gesture, every hint of the modest smile that I would never see again beyond the dream world. As I ran back to the dugout at the mark of the third consecutive out, I suddenly broke. I began to cry, and although I imagined that these tears would be as internal as my thoughts in the line of my vision, when I reached up to touch my cheek, I could feel the salt water against my fingers. The teardrop fell from my index finger and transformed into a sea of liquid beneath my feet. No longer was I wearing cleats but flip-flops, and I knew exactly where I was, Bethany Beach, Delaware, the family beach house, the most radiant place on the planet. Or at least that's what I thought growing up. I used to look forward to our summer vacations to Delaware, the way that members of my extended family would take turns each night cooking something for the rest of us. The walks into town for clam strips and French fries coated thick with sea salt, the fear of jellyfish just beneath the surface of the shore. It was dawn, and my father and I were the only ones awake. In fact, I had a strange feeling that he and I hadn't even gone to bed the previous night. His wine glass was tipped over, resting against his foot, leaving a stain of red in the Atlantic sand. We were fishing. My father had always been a fisherman, me not so much. In my eyes, fishing was always just an excuse for us to watch the sunrise together. It began to peek over the horizon line, turning the clouds above into chaotic masses of pinkish-orange cotton candy, which reflected along the surface of the sea. I wanted to say something to him so badly, but no matter how strongly I willed it, my mouth would not move. Seconds of silence turned to minutes before, without warning, I whispered, "Pretty, huh, Dad?" He took a few moments to respond, but eventually he cleared his throat, turned to me, and whispered back, "Pretty as a picture." The last memory that I was permitted to spend with my father caught me off guard, because as I began to re-experience it, I promptly recognized it from my recent past. It was the memory of my father breaking the news to me that he had been diagnosed with esophageal cancer. We were sitting at the kitchen table, my brother absent and my mother asleep on the living room couch. At first I didn't want to listen to the words coming out of his mouth. I didn't want to hear it again. I questioned why my mind would choose to bring me back there, if this whole opportunity was some sort of strange, disorganized fluke, empty of any meaning, but that couldn't be right. I remember staring off into the distance of the dining room as my father spoke to me and explained that everything would work itself out, that he'd make it. The next words that he spoke, rather softly, were, "Look at me, please, son, look at me." But I didn't. Though I had heard his words clearly, my past self made the choice to pretend that I had not. My past self kept my eyes fixed on the living room floor, counting the tiles. My present self knows this because my present self paid no attention to the tiles in the other room. Exiting the mist took much more strength than entering it did, but it wasn't the physical sort of strength that one might imagine. It was an unfamiliar strength, an emotional strength which I had never before utilized, one that I assumed I would be reacquainted with often over the next few years. I navigated my way through the hospital air, reclaiming my physical form and touching my feet to the floor. At first I thought it might be possible to leap quickly back into the mist and spend an eternity with my father, reliving memories in a self-made pseudo-heaven. But as I looked down at my father's lips, I realized that there was nothing left to escape from them. I stared into his eyes one last time before closing their lids with my fingertips, though there was no sense of understanding hiding in their background. No sense of anything, really. Just a look of blankness which I could not read. They were still beautiful, remarkably beautiful, as his eyes had always been. I read somewhere once that people who pass away with their eyes open do so because they have died so painlessly that their bodies fail to respond. That may not be true, but I'd certainly like to believe it. I'd like to believe that, in the moments before he died, he had the opportunity to travel through time in a similar fashion as I did. that he died freely and contently in the place of his choice, doing whatever it was that he liked to do most. Now my father traces the outline of his new home, feeling nothing, knowing nothing. I pour into the creases of my hands what I imagine to be his ear, and let a little bit of him go. His ruins do not fall without grace. The residue confuses itself with vigor, and disappears from sight without ever reaching the floorboards. My right hand spells out his name, but when I try to picture his face, the image rejects itself and I am thrown into memories smothered in salt water. How you resemble those places now, Father, shapeless and shut in by a case without a code. I could dig into you for days and I'd never find any answers. I could dig into you for years and my form would slowly fall away too. Later, for a moment, the air would fill with the scent of something both vivid and nondescript, but I'd pull myself away from the photograph before it would carry me to the pen.